Thank you, Randy, and welcome everyone. I'm honored to be here with all of you. Before we begin, I would like to go through a few virtual meeting housekeeping items. We know that due to competing demands, many of you will be coming in and out of the symposium at various times. We are recording all sessions, so you will be able to access them later. During our breaks, you will have the opportunity to participate remotely in 1-minute mindfulness activities and exercise, which is greatly needed in our virtual space now. Take a break to reflect on and present on improve your focus on the well-being. Everyone, except for the speakers, will be muted today. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. If you would like to make a comment, please use the chat function. If you have any questions about Zoom links, technical issues, or agenda, please message the meeting host directly in the chat option. And please remember to complete the evaluation form, which will be provided at the end of the symposium through a link in the chat. We rely heavily on your input, and the feedback you provide will make the symposium better each year. We will also like to kick off the symposium with a few virtual icebreakers. So please answer these questions in the chat. For example, who are you? Which organization are you with? Where are you joining us from? And where's your favorite place that you traveled or vacationed to? So please take the time right now to just go ahead and add those icebreaker answers into the chat box, and then we'll go ahead and just get started as I review today's agenda. So first, we will begin with our keynote speaker, Dr. Kristen Carmen, Director of Public and Patient Engagement at PCORI. Next, we will hear from Dr. Carrie Wolinitz, Deputy Director for Health and Life Science at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, who will discuss the social determinants of health policy and patient science. We will also learn about mental health and patient science from Dr. Regina James, Chief of the Division of Diversity and Health Equity at the American Psychiatric Association. We will also hear from Mr. Nicholas Brook. He'll provide an international perspective on global health equity. And then we'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Miller, who will present on how to dismantle health disparities and build trust in patient centricity and life science. Last but not least, we will also hear from a variety of panelists, including Ms. Ricky Fairley, Dr. Ruben Mesa, Dr. Alicia Shilton-Lloyd, and Ms. Alexis Racine Miller, who will talk about the experience with Medicaid and diverse patient access in clinical trials. We have a very packed day, as you can see, but we're looking forward to learning a lot and implementing these learnings into our future work. So what are the objectives for today? So we are here to bring together the National Health Council research community to advance the science of patient engagement and discuss health equity and actionable solutions to inequity. We also will be providing a forum to foster networking, communication, and potential collaborations among patient groups, nonprofits, academia, payers, healthcare system, industry, and others, and to foster a greater understanding among stakeholders regarding the research interests, needs, capacity, and accomplishments. Before we get started with our keynote speaker, Dr. Carmen, I want to briefly address the 2022 symposium theme, From Research to Action, Health Equity for All. This topic is incredibly important to both the National Council and me, as a scientific leader, as a person of underserved background, as a Latino. In this healthcare community, we're at the juncture to ensure equitable health outcomes, research, and that resources are directed to those who have historically been underrepresented, marginalized, and not included in important health conversations. Though these issues have existed historically, the COVID-19 pandemic and continued social unrest illuminated these inequities and exacerbated health disparities. The National Health Council is committed to incorporating health equity through all of our work, as exemplified through our 2022-2024 strategic plan. We are deeply excited to learn about our colleagues, partners, and what others are doing in this space as we constantly improve our work and learn new information about how to conduct equitable health research and education in the advancement of patient engagement and science. Now, with that said, I have the pleasure to introducing Dr. Kristen Carmen, who is the Director of Public and Patient Engagement with PCORI. In this position, she is responsible for leading and directing PCORI's overall efforts to see that patients and other healthcare stakeholders are fully involved and guide all aspects of PCORI work. She leads the science of engagement at PCORI, including developing the practice and evidence of engagement through intramural efforts and external funding. Dr. Carmen previously was at the American Institutes for Research, where she served as Vice President and Director of the Center for Patient Consumer Engagement and Director of Health Policy and Research Group, where she led a team of more than 100 health services research professionals. In that role, she helped to conduct research on issues of public importance in healthcare, quality access, and financing, comparative effectiveness, patient and family engagement, health systems improvement, public deliberation, and health-related communications. So you can see her expertise is so renowned that we're just very excited to have her as her keynote speaker for the 2022 Science of Patient Engagement Symposium. So now it is my privilege to turn over to the keynote speaker, Dr. Kristen Carmen. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Omar. I really appreciate that very generous introduction. I just want to note that PCORI as an institution and myself personally have had a pretty deep relationship with the National Health Council and really appreciate all the work that you and your organization do, and particularly some of the recent engagements of Randy and all your staff. So it's really both a pleasure and it feels like a privilege to be able to talk today. Forgive my voice a little bit. Fall allergies. Speaking of places one likes to go, I spent a few days in the Shenandoahs, which is always a place that is always a little bit different and new and a wonderful place to visit. So if you've not been there, I encourage you to go. So I just want to note that, let's go to the next slide, please. I loved what you said, Omar, about this is about actionable solutions to health equity. And what I'm going to outline for you today is a little bit about PCORI, because I think that's always important. Many of you know about it, some don't. It's important for context setting, for as I describe what we do in engagement and what we've learned about engagement and how you can think about to apply it to your own work. A little bit about our future steps, influenced by many of the organizations who are participating in the National Health Council, by the by, and then some questions and discussion, although I know you're going to be off to lots of other things. But I think in part of the argument here is that engagement of communities, community organizations, and individuals really is one of the actionable solutions to health equity. And so I hope you'll take this slide deck in with that in mind. Can we go to the next slide, please? Just want to remind you that PCORI's core mission, we're an independent research organization. We were authorized by Congress in 2010. We were authorized in 2019. Our mission is to help people make informed healthcare decisions, also to improve healthcare delivery outcomes. And we do this by promoting high quality, high integrity evidence that is really guided by patients, caregivers, and other organizations, many like yourselves. We do clinical comparative effectiveness research, which compares the effectiveness of multiple treatments or interventions. So that is our remit and our specific focus. And we're particularly interested in what we call patient-centered outcomes research research, which really focuses on the outcomes that matter most to patients, caregivers, and those who care for them. We can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to note, since we were reauthorized, and thank you very much to many of the organizations who supported us. We've been through a pretty extensive strategic plan. Just want to remind you that while comparative effectiveness research is central to our work, it's only part of really a broader holistic approach that involves these other key elements, right? One is obviously engagement, which we're talking about here today. Dissemination and implementation is critical to everything we do, as well as the development of infrastructure needed to conduct comparative effectiveness research. And I think one final aspect I'll note, especially given the next speaker, is that we're really trying to put a sharper focus on addressing the key drivers of health beyond the purely clinical sphere, right? This includes social, cultural, and environmental issues in the real world in which patients live, work, learn, and play. Can you go to the next slide, please? I won't go into the details, but I wanted you to have this. At the heart of our strategic plan is really some ambitious long-term goals, and these are the national priorities for health, which you see on the left side of the screen. These will guide our research funding and various other initiatives. Our research agenda, which is on the right side, is the more concrete framework for the national priorities. Here again, you see the kind of the holistic themes of patient engagement, health equity. I do want you to note critically that part of our national priority is also to achieve health equity. And just to note a couple other areas that you don't see on this list, or of course we also have as a part of our reauthorizing law, a requirement to focus on maternal mortality, morbidity, intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we also have the new authority to capture the full range of clinical and patient-centered outcomes. And that includes the potential burdens and economic impacts of healthcare services. Terrific and important work going forward. Can we go to the next slide? This is just to remind you of the, as of March 22, what we've committed, about 3.4 billion. We've conducted 1,900 research projects. You see our most studied conditions and populations of interest on the right-hand side. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is just to show that our research projects span really most major health conditions across diverse populations, including racial and ethnic groups, women, and urban and rural populations. Can we go to the next slide now? So what do we mean by engagement? What have we done? What is the PCORI approach, and what have we learned from this? So we can go to the next slide, please. I want to start with a couple formal definitions in the PCORI context and that are central to this talk. So when patient-centeredness in the PCORI context means the project answers questions or examines the outcomes that matter to patients within the context of patient preferences. Research questions and outcomes should really reflect the interests and priorities of patients and other stakeholders. In patient and stakeholder engagement, we anticipate that patients are partners, not subjects, and that there is active and meaningful engagement in our projects. Next slide, please. And this is really just to give you our basic theory of action. Why do we engage? And the rubric you might be familiar with is something that we provide to folks to give some guidance on how to think about engagement in our research awards. But we do it to influence research to be patient-centered, relevant, and useful. So there's a theory of action behind this, right? To establish trust and a sense of legitimacy and research findings, which is critical if you're thinking about reaching communities, and to encourage successful uptake and use of research findings, right? If you're patient-centered, relevant, and useful, you build trust, you have a much more greater likelihood of things being taken up and used. And that's not just for patients, of course, that's for all stakeholders. We can go to the next slide, please. I just want to note too, because many of you who are familiar with PCORI know we do engagement in everything we do. It's at the central heart of what we do. When I'm talking about the findings today in our lessons learned, I am centering you on the conduct of research, where we require engagement in all our research awards. When you think of our pipeline all the way through our topics that we discussed, the strategic plan, many of you are involved in giving us input into that whole plan, all the way through influence on policy and practice, the evidence base I'm sharing with you, and the focal point of some of the research I'm going to talk to you about in our next steps in research, do, if not solely, primarily focus on the research projects and conduct of engagement in research awards. Can we go to the next slide, please? So let's talk a little bit about what we have learned. You can go to the next slide now. So by studying engagement across our research projects, our intramural research sometimes, and other projects, what we have learned is on this slide at a very high level. So I'm just going to walk you through, because I think these are important to explaining also where we're going in our next steps in research. So we learned that engagement is feasible in all phases of comparative effectiveness research and PCOR with a variety of stakeholders, i.e., it can be done. It can be done in almost all contexts, places, and types of projects. It can influence the design and conduct of research studies. It can impact research in meaningful ways, and that includes the acceptability, feasibility, quality, and relevance. And these two areas I'm going to talk quite a bit about. It's partner dynamic, or partner involvement is dynamic, it's nonlinear, it's iterative, it takes different forms over the course of the study. There's no one way. It can benefit partners, PIs, communities, and researchers. Our approach has altered the culture of research. There are real challenges to doing this, however, and it's related to infrastructure, resources, people, teams, organization policies, and also balancing views and priorities. And there's a lot more to learn about the methods and the impact of effective and inclusive engagement. So with that summary, I'm going to dive into some more specific findings. Go to the next slide. One of the things we've learned throughout our projects is that there are a continuum of engagement practices. Everything ranging from, on the left-hand side, input, we would call that sort of research on, that could be focus groups, crowdsourcing, might be a survey, all the way through consultation, collaboration to shared leadership. What we're just trying to note here is that how investigators and teams work together can range from giving advice to really collaborative to genuinely shared leadership. And as we're talking about health equity and achieving health equity, we have heard a lot of requests and demands from communities to see this shift more to the right, having a real authority and role in decision and shared leadership. And I would say our projects do a variety of these approaches, and sometimes within the same project, they might be using one approach or another. Could we go to the next slide, please? So one of the things we've learned in our research is that engagement influences all aspects of comparative effectiveness research projects. And if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, by having patients, stakeholders, and others involved in the conduct of the research in an ongoing way, it influences the focus of research, the design, intervention, tailoring, and delivery, recruitment, retention, data collection, data analysis, and dissemination. Right. And so this is really important. And I think the recruitment and retention might be something that probably feels quite familiar and expectable. And that could be, so for example, designing outreach and recruitment strategies. For example, we have a project where they help to support tailoring resources to help children and patients manage type 1 diabetes. And so stakeholders provided input that really helped the study appeal to families from traditionally who experienced disparities in diabetes control and spoke in favor of in-person recruitment. They turned out they did this, and so they had a much more proportionate representation of the population demographics that are most affected by this condition in that project. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk you through another example because I think it helps to ground what we learned about influence and what we mean. So if we think about research focus, which was on the previous slide, what we mean by that is it influences the identification of the topic. It can influence the formulation or expansion of research aims and questions. It can alter the choice of comparators, like what is being compared to what, and also determination of research outcomes, both primary and secondary. Can we go to the next slide? So here's an example of a project where this was a randomized controlled trial comparing medications and two different approaches to exercise for back pain. It included the primary outcome measures of physical activity and walking, specifically because patient partners stressed the importance of maintaining their independence. So patients really said, we really want to understand physical activity and walking capacity as an outcome of this study. And so patients and stakeholders work together to produce these plans. And so that's a very meaningful outcome, because when we think about whether or not individuals are going to use findings, are interested in the outcomes of research, then it's really critical for them to have an impact on what gets studies, but also the outcomes that they're supposed to be thinking about and doing something about in terms of action and their decision making. Go to the next slide, please. A key question, as I just said to you, so, okay, having all this involvement at all these different points in the project has an influence. We were really interested in, but how does that happen, right? What occurs and how does it occur? So one of our most important findings from a recent study is that engagement's not one thing. It doesn't happen in just one way. It's neither completely successful or unsuccessful, either within a project or across projects. Engagement is also iterative and dynamic, which I signaled a little bit earlier to you, right? So it changes as the project changes or as the processes unfold. Another really important thing I'd like to share with you, and that this slide tries to highlight, is that certain kinds of influence require different kinds of relationships and interactions on a project. And let me give you an example. So if we think about the confirming and the refining types, which is in the middle of the slide, right? Refining is partners edit or modify what you get. Oh, I've got this idea. Here's a refinement. I think this for oftentimes materials and other things, you could do this in a way people understand better. Confirming is partners validate. This is fabulous, right? This is great. It's fairly unidirectional. I've got something. Tell me what you think of it. However, other types of influence that we have seen in projects like redirecting. And that's an example where partners meaningfully shift the direction or thinking on a particular issue on a project. Only happen when we're co-producing. You can only redirect if you're involved in a project in an ongoing way, sitting at the table and say, aha, your partner say, you may think that's a wonderful idea. You didn't actually ask us to look at that, but we really need to tell you we don't think that's going to work, right? That's really redirecting and can be a really critical component of input on projects. And again, this only happens along with co-producing when they're sitting at the table in a meaningful way. I will note, and you see this on the slide, there are certainly occasions where there's limited or no influence. Sometimes it's because it couldn't be done. It could be in some of our studies that there hadn't been enough time in the projects to know what the influence is. But I think thinking about these approaches to bring us back to sort of whether they're involved from an input to co-direction leadership, this helps you see why having different ways of having partners involved, not just unidirectionally, but co-directionally, can be really valuable on projects. Can we go to the next slide? So I want to sort of, so I've talked to you about how having people involved really influences the conduct of the study, things, discrete decisions, discrete events, behaviors, and strategies, which can be very impactful and helpful for projects. I want to talk now a little bit about how PIs and the participants in the projects interpret what the impact of how they've shaped those projects. These are the impacts on the project. So it's their interpretation of how these influences shape the overall project. Think of this as a more intermediate, right? You go from this direct, discrete behavior to moving towards actually having an influence on the project, and it's from their perspective. And obviously, this is a part of the early step towards the ultimate impact of of improving healthcare, improving outcomes, uptake, et cetera, right? So think of this as an intermediate part of this. So we can go to the next slide, please. So engagement impacts in multiple ways, such as acceptability. And this is, for example, really helping develop studies in which patients and clinicians are willing to participate. That's pretty important, right? User orientation and acceptability. You can have the greatest study in the world, but if people won't participate, you're not really going to be able to complete the study. Feasibility also refers to interventions, enrollment, and data collection that are more doable in real-world settings. So what the partners and the PI say, what this influence has led to across the project is more feasible projects in these ways. And relevance as well, right? The results are more applicable and important for decision-making. Again, note in some cases, sometimes there's influences on project that people can't identify a downstream effect. But again, sometimes that's because we don't really know totally the downstream effect of this. And when we look across the themes for how engagement really shapes the project, the acceptability, the feasibility, quality, and relevance, often say to people, these are exactly the kinds of things that was in PCORI's legislative mandate and continues in our mandate about making sure that we have a pragmatic real-world research and answering pragmatic real-world questions. So these are really critical things to be addressed in the research. We can go to the next slide, please. So let me just make this a teeny bit more granular so it doesn't feel quite so abstract potentially. So I just want to give you one example. So here is the study team was planning to evaluate interventions to improve quality of life for Latina breast cancer survivors and their caregivers. So the process in this case was patient, caregiver, clinician, and community group partners helped to plan the study eligibility, the strategies for increasing participation, and specific components of the intervention. So what was the effect of the process and the participation? Well, the team expanded eligibility criteria to any survivor, regardless of time since diagnosis. They reduced the number of intervention sessions to improve participation and retention, right? Made it more doable and acceptable. And the interventions include workshops on topics that were really important to patients and caregivers that hadn't originally been outlined, like stress and sexual intimacy. Thus, the intention being then you have an intervention that is more relevant to the populations and the individuals. So that's just to give you a kind of a more granular example. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these examples. from the research. So I want to share with you that this is built off of a lot of very careful qualitative research and other factors. Hopefully, though, that does make it a little bit more granular. Can we go to the next slide, please? I want to note that there are benefits to everyone. I told you earlier when we were going through the big slide, sort of describing all the different things that were we've learned from engagement. There are benefits for all involved. I think some of this will feel familiar to you. I'm going to pop up a little bit on the trust. Obviously, patient stakeholders, they have more knowledge, they have more enthusiasm. Researchers critically get a much deeper understanding of the communities and the individuals and the concerns for their study populations. We often hear from researchers they would not do this in any other way. For communities, this helps to build trust. It increases their research capacity and really strengthens relationships. And I wanted to share with you that trust, as you know, is critical to engaging communities, especially communities that have historically felt left out of activities, have felt left out of research, have felt like they have not been the focus of research. And one of the things that we've been learning about trust is that it's really ongoing, overarching, and quite dynamic. We note that what we hear is it has to be cultivated and earned. And it's something that is discussed by patients and stakeholders as attributes of individuals, but also of organizations. And it really can be broken by individuals and researchers by not maintaining trust. And it really has to be actively built and rebuilt with communities. And what we've heard is that trustworthiness are essential for effective partnerships. It is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for it. And that engagement and trust are mutually reinforcing, right? So if you're engaging people meaningfully, it also helps to build trust. As one person said to me once, if you want me to trust you and you want me to engage with your work and you want me to participate, you have to show me you share my values. So that just involves that real meaningful engagement and continuous engagement. And the findings we have from our research, I think, are really consistent with a lot of external research. And I think it also requires that patients and stakeholders don't have the same power that we do, and that if we are going to build that trust, this is where really shifting the power balance is really critical, so that they feel like you are sharing power with them and that they can have the power and they feel capable and able to contribute. As I said, I think this has benefits for everybody involved. You can go to the next slide, please. I always want to add this slide to our context that, of course, engagement can be challenging. Obviously, sometimes there's not necessary infrastructure resources, people and teams. You have to have access, ensuring diversity. Obviously, creating an environment in which people feel able and capable of engaging can be challenging, but is absolutely critical. We have a lot of tools and resources we've been creating to help support people. Organizations have competing priorities, and of course, there's a lot around balancing views and priorities. And I just want to note about that's one of the most critical components, because part of engagement is disruptive. You are bringing differing perspectives. There are going to be value conflicts. And what we've learned is you just have to acknowledge these and work through these. And again, we have some tools to think about that. You can go to the next slide, please. So coming out of what we learned, I just wanted to share with you very quickly what PCORI views as its next steps in this process. And to address these challenges, we are working on filling these evidence gaps. So the objective of a new initiative we have is to build an actionable evidence base that clearly identifies the methods and approaches that lead to effective engagement. So we are developing a new project that is focusing on improving engagement practice, providing guidance and resources, further guidance and resources that really focuses on how do we ensure the inclusion of diverse and representative partners in different context settings and communities, and also to ensure equity in research. Next slide, please. I won't go over this, but it's the theory of action, which is if we fund studies for the science of engagement, in particular, it helps to make sure that it's efficient, aligned, and equitable and more meaningful influence. That's better engagement, leads to more meaningful patient comparative effectiveness research, and hopefully more trustworthy as a part of that. And it helps us to achieve the long-term impacts around national priorities and therefore better healthcare decisions, care, and outcomes. Next slide, please. This is just a note that it's for you to see that there is an overarching agenda in terms of where we're going to. What you see in black, just as I mentioned, is the early starting point, and we hope to move towards which approaches should be combined to achieve aims and under what conditions works best, how should they be modified and resourced for different context settings and communities. So we view this as a long-term process of moving from intramural research that we've been doing as best we can to really asking the field to do work on this through PFA and more research on this that's funded through our research process. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned this, just these are the two initial priorities. We can go to the next slide. I just want to mention one quick reference in resources. There's many others here. I won't go over all of them, but I did want to highlight two very important things because this is, you're really focusing on health equity and achieving equity. Go to the next slide. Our engagement award program supports projects to build community of patients and stakeholders who can participate in PCOR and C and also to disseminate studies. Next slide. We have a new award called Building Capacity for Small Organizations to Engage in PCOR-SEER. This was at the behest of many of our partners and communities who wanted, I really felt that small organizations needed better capacity building in order to participate. So this is specifically targeted to them, and it's a new opportunity to address their needs. Encourage you, if you have any organizations you think could engage in this, to please look at this. It's new, and it really is trying to attend to developing those skill sets and involves technical assistance and support for small community organizations to apply. Next slide, please. And I just want to note, we just put out a pre-announcement, a notice of upcoming targeted PCORI funding announcement. It's called Partnering Research and Community Organizations for Novel Health Equity Research. It's focusing on determinants of maternal health. I will note it will require fulsome community-based participation and is a really important initiative. I can't say much more because we just put out the notice of upcoming announcement, but please stay tuned and please do share this with communities you think might be very interested in partnering on this topic. And there are a number of other slides in here, but they're mostly for background and resources for you to access some of our tools, resources, et cetera. So we can go to the next slide. So that was a magical mystery tour, Omar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Carmen. This has been very insightful, and we just appreciate your time and sharing the initiatives from PCORI, as many of our members are from the patient group. They understand that they value so much the work that PCORI helps to fund. So thank you so much for joining us today. I welcome anyone who may have questions to please enter those questions in the Q&A option of our Zoom. But I do have a question to start us off, Dr. Carmen. So, yesterday we started to build up on trustworthiness, and that also was a theme from the last year's symposium. Yeah. Yesterday we focused also on how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these disparities and also the issues around trust in science. So can you help us to answer how PCORI has shifted also the priorities due to the pandemic, and has that changed anything in your field?
Well, I mean, as an institution, PCORI has focused a great deal of resources and in fact came up with some structures to do some immediate research on COVID that actually didn't go through some of our normal process, but really to try to create rapid research around COVID. Don't have findings yet, so I can't share the outcomes of that, but we put in entire processes to much more rapidly address that. We also have, for our engagement awards, we have specific awards, and we had add-on awards to allow communities to provide information and to learn from what they're learning about COVID. Again, we're in the middle of summarizing a lot of that, so it's a timely question. We're working on because as you know, given the timing, right, we funded these a bit ago. Now we're trying to see what are we learning about the experiences of individual patients and also researchers. I will also note on the research side, we gave a lot of flexibility to organizations. You can imagine that there was some real challenges in the conduct of research because of COVID, right? Especially for some of our projects, which required in-person types of interventions. One of our primary responses was to provide extra time, sometimes extra resources, allows projects to consider how they were going about their interventions and their studies. And that also includes the engagement. Obviously, what we found was a great deal of movement towards online engagement. What I can say about that is many of the best practices in engagement in general are critical for the online engagement. Many of our projects did have success with it. I'm not going to tell you this is completely a synthetic answer, but I can tell you anecdotally, a lot of projects that were able to provide the resources and support for individuals to be able to engage. Sometimes they needed iPads, sometimes they needed other information, right, to make it possible for them. And I think it took a lot more intensive support sometimes. But there were also a lot of patients and stakeholders who appreciated the opportunity to do it this way. They have health conditions normally, et cetera. What I would say is that our communities went through a lot, Omar. I'm sure you all know that. It has been a traumatizing and difficult experience. And one of the key messages we heard from the community-based organizations coming out of COVID is, you must also support us. We are supporting the community-based participants who are engaging in your research, but who is supporting us? How are we going to be able to continue to be viable in our communities so that you can have access? So I would say we're still working through this, but I can tell you it was a huge clarion call. And you will see in the new partner PFA, it is in part a broader PCORI response to seeing what we can do down that. So stay tuned, but it is certainly, we are innovating and reacting rapidly, sometimes a little more slowly, but really trying to address a lot of what we've learned. And also stay tuned for more details from what we've learned, but I don't have it at my fingertips because we're just now really trying to summarize it.
No, sure. Thank you. So one of our participants asked, you mentioned the involvement of patients in the dissemination of data, meaning the final step in the planning and conducting research and disseminating data. So how is PCORI using or recommending plain language approaches to do this? And the follow-up is, are there any sort of additional elements that PCORI recommends to address issues in cultural awareness in plain language?
Well, so a couple of things. PCORI as an institution, for every single research award, publishes a plain language summary for lay audiences. It also publishes a summary for clinician professional audiences as a practice. PCORI also funds researchers to share the findings from their study, aggregate, not individual level, with their partners, and does provide guidance and support for thinking about how to do that in a way where your partners can understand it. We have an extensive dissemination and implementation plan. The dissemination as a part of the dissemination projects really focus on findings that PCORI deems as really appropriate and valuable, and we have partnerships, et cetera. But we also have, through the engagement awards, a program where communities can come to PCORI and say, we want to disseminate a finding. Now, it has to be a finding, obviously, that isn't impactful, et cetera, right? And those communities can come together and apply for an engagement award. And the opportunity here is for those communities to think about, how do we tailor dissemination to our community and our community needs? So I strongly encourage you to think about some of those applications. And we also have a new initiative to allow health delivery systems to apply for PCORI for funding to disseminate key findings as well. So we continue to try to find ways to allow systems and individuals and organizations who are most able to deliver that information to communicate it. But I do encourage you to look at our plain language summaries on our website and a variety of that information, because I think it'll be very helpful.
Excellent, excellent. And one last question, since I know we're running here on time before our break, but you mentioned the breast cancer study that one of your stakeholders or funders did on Latinas. One of the other questions is, what are some examples of project result dissemination approaches that were meaningful to individuals from underrepresented communities?
So your question is specific. So what I can say is there are projects. If you have someone who specifically wants to know which projects, I would have to go back and do that. We have 600 projects, research projects. We now have hundreds of dissemination implementation projects. If you just let me know who has a key interest in that community and projects, I'd be happy to supply that information. But I would be kidding you if I told you I had that at the top of my head. We just have so many projects now, but I'm happy to supply that information.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. Thank you again, Dr. Carmen. This has been a wonderful keynote. So we just appreciate, again, your time. I know you're super busy, so I know many of our attendees are just excited to hear your talk. And you have definitely given us so much to think about and the value that PCORI brings to advancing research or patient engagement efforts. So this has just been very insightful. We now will have about 15-minute break. So please take this opportunity to stretch your legs, and we'll meet here again around 11:15 a.m. Eastern time. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Carmen.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And anybody has questions or want to have further conversations, please let me know.
Absolutely.
Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.